Jordan Peterson has been called the stupid man's smart person. And one of my favourites, a Messiah-cum-surrogate-dad for gormless dimwits. He is, according to the New York Times, a patriarchal pseudo-intellectual riding his devilish dark horse into stardom and corrupting everybody in his path. At best, an idiot fraud, and at worst, the most dangerous thinker in the West. Well, I beg to differ. I have a lot of admiration for Dr. Jordan Peterson. His new book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, has been a bestseller on Amazon for most of 2018 and has sold over 3 million copies. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist and now a media personality. He has lectured to more than 250,000 people across North America, Europe and Australia. Jordan Peterson's videos on YouTube feature Dr. Peterson's university and public lectures, including a highly viewed 15-part biblical series on Genesis. Peterson has 1.8 million subscribers with 90 million views. With all the pirated videos around, his work has been viewed multiplied billions of times. His original self-analysis program, the Self-Authoring Suite, has helped over 200,000 people resolve the problems of their past and radically improve their future. Well, whatever the mainstream media think about Dr. Jordan Peterson, I like him. Before I launch into my 7 reasons why I like him, I've asked my friend Sam to share his top 3 reasons why he likes Dr. Jordan Peterson.
You know, there's so much that I like about Jordan Peterson that it's really hard to make a short list, but I guess the first thing would be how articulate he is, you know, how clear and concise he is in his thoughts and in his communication.
Archetypal themes are archetypal because they actually speak of the structure of human experience. That's why they last. And so it's human nature and human experience has a pattern. You don't have the capacity to articulate that pattern as an individual, in part because your life is too short. You just can't figure it out. But the ancient representations of those patterns are everywhere around you. And you know some of them in image, you cotton onto them automatically. You fall into them if you go to a movie, for example, because movies always express archetypal themes. If you hear them articulated, you think, I knew that. I knew that. I just didn't know how to say it. Yeah. That's the Platonic idea of learning as remembering. Your soul already knows, but it doesn't have the words. Yep. And so when people talk to me about watching my lectures, let's say, they basically say one of 2 things. If it's not just a simple thank you, they say one of 2 things. A third of them say, a quarter of them say, when I listen to you talk, it's as if you're telling me things that I already know. Yeah. It's like, yeah, well, that's exactly right, because that's what archetypal stories are. They're the description of what you already know. But that can be articulated, and then who you are and how you see yourself and the way you describe yourself all become the same thing. So that's wonderful. Then you're not at odds with yourself, you know? And then then you're a functioning unity, and that makes you much stronger and more indomitable than you would otherwise be.
I think number 2 would be how he's a voice of reason at this point in time, especially when there's so much noise, particularly in the media, that he can have that voice of logic and reason that cuts through that we really, really need to hear.
If you're concerned about knife crime, then maybe one of the things you don't want to do is have your police investigating offensive speech. And one of the things I do see happening in the UK as an outsider that's really quite terrifying to me is that there are increasing restrictions put on people's ability to speak forthrightly, and that the consequence of that restriction and the criminalization of what hypothetically constitutes offensive speech is going to be a cure that's so much more worse than the disease that we can hardly imagine it. It's a dreadful thing to see that happening in the UK. And so, I mean, people say things that are reprehensible all the time, but we can't always agree on what they are. But to start to criminalize that's hypothetical.
Are you saying nothing that anybody says should ever be counted as a crime?
Well, there's incitement to crime. that should be counted as a crime, and has been for a very long time in the British common law tradition. But other than that, you should be very careful about what you regulate as speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define hate? That's the real issue. It's not that there's not hate. There's plenty of it. The question is, who defines hate?
And I think the third thing, I love how he's an advocate for the individual to be able to reach their full potential. You know, he just says to stand up, take responsibility for those that are entrusted to you. And he can play the long game in that thought and see how much better society is going to be if we're full of a group of individuals that are taking responsibility and fulfilling their full potential.
There's zero harm in it, right? It's just people putting their lives together. They're not mucking about with other people. They're not trying to make broad-scale social transformations about which they have no idea. They're trying to make their immediate environment better. And it's working. It's like, great. It's great.
You say there's zero harm in it. I'd say as a former legislator that there's an enormous amount of good in it. A country is only the sum total of the people that make it up. To the extent that they're put together, resilient, able to contribute, don't have to ask others to help them, the stronger the nation and the society will be.
And rapidly. Like, I was thinking the other day, a journalist asked me why why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying, the young men, for example, and I thought, why? Yeah, that's a good question. He says, well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it. It's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up, and you know, they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and attentive when they come up to talk to me, and then they have 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them, and they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, and I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I hadn't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. Yeah. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see. And
that's fantastic.
So I only see that his message is a positive one and is a really critical thought leader at this point in time.
I believe that Dr. Jordan Peterson possesses a lot of old-fashioned humility, and he believes in living a life of integrity and encourages others to do the same. Albert Einstein said, "Try not to become men of success, but become men of value." Let's hear Peterson in his own words.
Truth in conception and action. Even people like Jacob, who are pretty damn morally ambivalent to begin with, get hammered a lot by what they go through. And what seems to happen is that they're hammered into some sort of ethical shape, right? So by the midpoint of their life's journey, there's people who are solidly planted, who you can trust and who don't betray being or themselves or their fellow man. And so it's an interesting, it seems reasonable to me to first assume that you have to establish a relationship with something that's transcendent. It might even be just the future version of you. And then second, that you have to align yourself with reality in a truthful manner, and that that's your best bet. And the biblical stories are actually quite realistic about that too, because they don't really say that if you do that, you're going to be instantly transported to the promised land. Like even Moses, as we'll find out in the Exodus stories, he never makes it to the promised land. And so
It's not like you're offered instantaneous final redemption if you move out forthrightly into the world, establish a faithful relationship with being, and attempt to conduct yourself with integrity. But it's your best bet, and it might be good enough. And even if it's not good enough, it's really preferable to the alternative, which seems to be something closely akin to hell, both personal and social.
The good news is, Jordan Peterson believes in such a thing as personal responsibility, which sounds a bit radical in a day and age of entitlement. He often says in his lectures, you have to learn to make your own bed. Jesus put it this way, you must pull the log out of your eye before you try to pull the speck out of your brother's. Check him out now.
Dr. Petersen, good to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
With the popularity of your book and your YouTube lectures, you're obviously tapping into something that nobody else is tapping into at the moment. What is that?
It's partly responsibility. I don't think that people have talked to young people about responsibility in any real sense. And been on their side at the same time for like 50 years. And that's just too long, because most people find the meaning in their life through responsibility.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that some people, through no fault of their own, have tough lives, and that no matter how much personal responsibility they take, that won't change? So, for example,
Yes.
You and I, we've had a lot of good fortune in our lives. We've been born to, reasonably affluent, peaceful countries. I have a job that I have worked hard at, but I've had lots of luck. You have written a book and done a series of lectures that have become embraced around the world. Some people don't get lucky breaks like
That's for sure. Some people just die, and horribly. Yeah, life's rough, no doubt about it. And if good luck comes your way, then you should be grateful for it. And if happiness manages to manifest itself, you should be grateful for that too.
But how do you give a personal responsibility message while taking account that for some people it's harder to take personal responsibility and the deck is stacked against them?
Well, I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree, because life is very difficult and we all die. So, but some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill, because the alternative makes everything worse. It's not like it's fair. I know perfectly well that people have brutal lives. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine, horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, bitter? Should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt. It's not necessarily their fault. That's not the point.
Jordan believes in the truth, in scientific truth, in reality. In an age that's filled with postmodernism, that can be quite a radical thought. But I'm so glad he's standing up for the truth. He will not back down. George Orwell said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act.
Well, why would I put my job on the line to have an opinion about compelled pronouns? I know why. Because the ability to speak your truth is the bulwark against hell. And losing your job? That's nothing. That's nothing compared to where things can go when they go badly. For me, it was just preventative. It's like, this isn't going in a good direction. Well, should you take a risk? It's like, you don't have that choice. You're silent? That's a risk. Now, most people don't understand the risks of silence. I happen to understand the risks of silence because I've been studying them for 40 years.
Is it frustrating for you to get so little support for these actions and for your protests?
Well, I wouldn't say that that's what happened.
And I don't mean so little support, because you're getting a lot of support outside of the university.
It's okay. It doesn't matter where the support comes from. Like, I mean, it's disappointing in the same way that it's disappointing for me to say I think the universities now do more harm than good. That's disappointing. But it doesn't, it's not surprising to me. Like, it isn't as if intellectuals are characterized by
an intrinsic moral superiority. Oh, they're smart, so they'll leap to the defense of what's right. It's like, no, there's no evidence for that. Intelligence and moral wisdom aren't the same thing.
One really good thing about Dr. Jordan Peterson is he loves to help people. As a clinical psychologist, he saw thousands of people in general practice. Now he reaches out to help not just thousands, but millions of people through his books, his lectures, and his speaking tours. I'm so glad. It's wonderful to have people that have great hearts for people to help them. Check it out now.
The other thing that people say, and this is more like 3/4 of them, is that they say, I was in a very dark place, I was addicted, I was drinking too much, I had a fragmented relationship with my fiancée, and I wasn't getting married. Things weren't going very well with my family, my relationship with my father was damaged, I didn't have any aim, I was wasting my time, some variant of that, some combination of those. And they said, well, I've been watching your lectures, I've decided to establish a purpose, I'm trying to tell the truth, and things are way better. And so let's say I've done maybe 8 or 9 large-scale public talks in the last 2 months, so that's probably 20,000 people, and about half of them, a third to half of them, have stayed afterwards to talk to me. So that's about 7,000 people who have said that to me. And then people stop me on the street all the time and tell me exactly that story, which is just wonderful. Like, you can't imagine how good it is to be able to go to places you've never been and to have people stop you on the street spontaneously and say, look, my life is way better than it was. It's like, it's so good. And I've got like, I don't know, 35,000 letters from people since last August. It's more than that. I can't keep track of them, and it's exactly the same thing.
Jordan Peterson has taken a strong stand against political correctness and cultural Marxism. Jacques Barzan says political correctness does not legislate tolerance, it only organises hatred. Take it away, Jordan.
Well, I think it's partly a form of narcissism.
Yes.
It's partly a consequence of the rise of the new rise again of say Marxist doctrine. I would say it's part of postmodernism. Maybe it's postmodernism more than anything else, because the postmodernists, that's a philosophical community, let's say, believe that the entire point of human categorization is power, and that dialogue between people is only a power dialogue, and that there's no real reality outside of interpretation, and that basically what we do is exchange interpretive viewpoints to ratchet up our dominance and status. And that's that. And there's no biology is an ideology, and the idea of the objective world is an ideology, and science is an ideology, and it's all interpretation all the way down, like turtles all the way down.
What do you mean by it's all about power? Like, in what way?
Well, you imagine that there are groups of people who are competing in the world for resources, I suppose, and that it's a zero-sum game, and it's every group against every other group. And the reason that we engage in dialogue isn't to establish the truth or move towards some closer approximation of reality, but to structure this social interaction so that our group comes up on top.
Right. And that is really what the problem is with all this, is that it's not just a matter of choosing to be defined in one way, but compelling others to define you in that way.
Well, one of the most awful elements of it, I think, is the idea that individuals should be defined in terms of their group identity at all. I mean, you could argue, and this is one of these weird inversions that's so characteristic of this chaotic state that we're in, when people originally started fighting against unfair discrimination, and I say unfair discrimination because lots of discrimination is fair. If you discriminate against people on the basis of their competence, that's perfectly reasonable. It's unfair discrimination that constitutes the proper battleground for people who have a more egalitarian viewpoint. But the initial idea was to eliminate the proclivity for people to be categorized according to their group identity, because that was interfering with everyone's ability to view them as competent individuals. But that got flipped probably in the 70s after the Soviet state so self-evidently was revealed as a catastrophe. That got flipped so that the world was turned into one group against another, power struggle from one group against another. And then the social justice warrior types and the lefties, even the Democratic Party, started categorizing everybody according to their ethnic or sexual or racial identity and made that the canonical element of their being. And that's an absolutely terrible thing to do. It leads to, in the Soviet Union, when that happened, for example, when they introduced that idea along with the notion of class guilt. So, for example, when the Soviets collectivized the farms, they pretty much wiped out or raped and froze to death all of their competent farmers. They called them kulaks, and they attributed class guilt to them because they were successful peasants, and they defined their success as oppression and theft. They killed all of them, pretty much, shipped them off to Siberia and froze them to death, and they were the productive agriculturalists in the Soviet Union. And then in the 1930s in the Ukraine, because of that, about 6 million Ukrainians starved to death.
Jordan is a family man. He supports mothers and fathers and is a tireless advocate for the well-being of children. He is also passionate to turn the tide of fatherlessness. Andy Minoa says, "I think in today's society we are dealing with an epidemic of fatherless homes."
That's actually why people get married, you know, just so you know. Because this is built into marital vows. I'm not leaving, ever, no matter what. It's like, okay, well, that definitely puts a boundary around our arguments, right? Because I can't say every time you manifest one of your flaws, which you're likely to do just as often as me, well, enough of this. It's like, that's horrible, man. If your whole life is, well, every time you get out of line, I'm out of here. It's like, how the hell are you? First of all, you're not going to admit to ever doing anything wrong. Second, you're going to be on your, you're like a scared cat the entire relationship because, well, who knows, it could just come to an end at any moment. It's like, you know, people say, well, if the possibility of divorce is open, it makes you free. It's like, yeah, that's what you want. You want to be free, eh? Really? Really? So you can't predict anything. That's what you're after. It's a vow. And it says, look, I know that you're trouble. Me too. So we won't leave, no matter what happens. Well, that's a hell of a vow, but that's why it's a vow, right? That's why you take it in front of a bunch of people. That's why it's supposed to be a sacred act. It's like, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Everything is mutable and changeable at any moment. Well, go ahead. You live your life like that and see what you're like when you're 50. Jesus, it's dismal. 2 or 3 divorces, your family's fragmented, you've got no continuity of narrative. And it's not good for the kids, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's a form of voluntary enslavement, I suppose, but it's also equivalent to the adoption of a responsibility. And there's more to it than that. If you can't run away, then you can solve your problems. Because it might be, okay, well, I'm stuck with you. So how about we fix things? Because the alternative is we're going to be in a boxing match for the next 40 years.
Jordan Peterson believes in transcendence. He also supports the Judeo-Christian value system that is the underpinning of Western civilization. He does not run from topics such as good or evil. Sidney Smith said, "It is the calling of great men not so much to preach new truths as to rescue from oblivion those old truths, which is our wisdom to remember and our weakness to forget."
This is the main question. Is there something, is there a set of ideas that Western civilization is predicated on that are more than just bloody opinion? That's the question. Because if there isn't, well then, what do you do about that? It's arbitrary? You're just holding it for no reason whatsoever? It could be a different system. There's no reason to stick with it. All of those things. Like it takes the core out of it. Well, that was Nietzsche's claim, right? He said, you take the core metaphysical presupposition out from underneath Western civilization, or any civilization for that matter, and the whole thing loosens, shakes, and crumbles. Well, for Nietzsche, the metaphysical presupposition was God. Well, and then the question, of course, well, what even does that mean? And on one hand, it means, I suppose, adherence to a dogmatic set of beliefs. But then you might ask yourself, well, is there something else that it means. It means at least the hypothesis of some transcendent value. It means at least that. This is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see, to me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic. To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God.
And yet Mr. Petersen, whilst he has high ideals, is just as human as you and I. When Pankaj Mishra, writing for the New York Review, insulted Jordan's Native American Indian friend, Jordan said, "You arrogant racist son of a bitch." Jordan Petersen also threatened to sue a university professor in the USA for libel and defamation. We are all mortal, we can all make mistakes, we all fall short. You see, there is only one who is perfect, and his name is Jesus, the Logos, the one that Dr. Petersen often refers to in his lectures. Jesus went about doing good and healing the sick, and then the mainstream establishment put him on a cross. They defamed his reputation with scorn, lies and hate. And while the blood poured out of his hands and out of his feet, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Wow. I don't think I could pray that prayer at that time. How about you? Yes, Mr. Petersen still has to meet his maker. We all do. But in the meantime, I'm very glad for Jordan Petersen's very courageous stand for the truth. I just pray he does not end up on a cross.